This video is brought to you in part by Mantis Sleep. More on them in a bit. This is the UDraw Game Tablet, a $70 Nintendo Wii peripheral released by THQ on November 14, 2010 that was so in demand by kids that you couldn't find it on shelves during its launch week, a product that overperformed so well that THQ didn't have enough units to launch the thing in Europe before Christmas. Within 6 months, it had sold 1.7 million units, far above expectations. This is also the UDraw Game Tablet, a hastily cobbled together peripheral for the PS3 and Xbox 360 released on November 15, 2011, against the apparent protests of at least half of the company. It launched without a target audience, without a killer app, hell, without a killer app even in production for this new model. It flopped so badly that 1.4 million units of this HD model never even made it to retailers, costing $100 million in lost revenue and putting the nail in the coffin of THQ's licensed kids games division. On November 10, 2012, THQ announced that it was about to default on $50 million in loans. It was only weeks away from filing for bankruptcy. To be clear, this drawing tablet wasn't the sole factor in the company's demise, but it was the breaking point, the symbol of all of THQ's bubbling issues up until then. THQ had fallen far and rapidly from its business peak in the year 2007 thanks to the following year's global financial crisis, as well as shifts in the gaming market as budgets and player expectations ballooned far past the licensed projects the publisher had cranked out on an almost monthly basis for over a decade. But even up through the very end, THQ was only one fumbled bag away from scraping through to the next console generation, a few months away from its delayed projects releasing and propping them up just a bit longer, one success away from turning it around entirely. Just as we look back today and think that the writing was on the wall and that THQ was destined to fail, we look at the UDraw today as that fumbled bag, as another stupid gimmick from a flailing company that was circling the drain. But the reality's far more interesting than that. It's the story of two separate groups within THQ, essentially operating independently and often at odds with one another, all while the CEO ignored the growing divide within the company. It's the story of a company swept up in overnight industry-wide change, but unlike so many other studios and publishers at the time, this was a company that was a single hard decision away at multiple different points from making it out. It shouldn't have failed. But that difficult decision would have cost far more of THQ's thousands of jobs than the 600 they had already cut at the start of the recession, and it involved completely moving away from what had given them years of success culminating in record numbers only months earlier. This tablet is the symbol of a company that went half in on two opposing strategies and died because of it. This is the UDraw Game Tablet and the collapse of THQ. Although the UDraw didn't enter production as far back as 2007, that's where we've got to go to set the table. This was the company's apex, the first time its annual revenue broke the $1 billion mark, placing it firmly as one of the top publishers in the industry. They found that success by dominating the licensed children's game market, or as they called it, their own KFC. Kids, Family, and Casual. For almost 15 years up to this point, the company's bread and butter was a never-ending stream of TV, film, and toy tie-ins on every game system with a pulse, and even some without. They were easy games to turn around. The source material meant that as long as the developers held to a reliable quality standard, the games would usually sell themselves. It was a safe bet game after game, low risk, high reward. In fact, for much of the mid-2000s, THQ even propped up a large part of the Australian game development scene, because they were providing consistent contract work like this or jobs at their internal Australian studio. There was lower demand for jobs in the game industry down under at the time, and although it didn't have the soul of developing original IP, it was a paycheck for companies like Halfbrick, who specialized in Game Boy and DS ports. THQ had built an empire of about 2,500 employees by the year 2007, off the backs of long-standing agreements with Nickelodeon, Disney, Mattel, WWE, and pretty much any company that made kid-focused anything. The company didn't do anything to prepare for a rainy day though, even as it warned investors in almost every annual financial statement that the licensed market was volatile and could dry up at any moment. Instead, as it often ended up doing, the company spoke one truth out loud and lived another behind the scenes, ignoring the risks and signing progressively longer licensing deals. With the transition between console generations taking longer than it ever had before, with parents waiting to buy the newest systems, THQ had to juggle several different versions of each property in order to cast the widest net. Although, to be fair, even when it didn't have to do that, THQ chose to greenlight a redundant amount of games. The Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 each had completely distinct WWE game franchises, a dozen different console WWE games from 2001 to 2005. Anyway, what was initially a sure thing, a profitable release structure that THQ had down to a science, would quickly become boom or bust. Where Pixar's Cars game was a runaway hit, selling 8 million copies across almost as many platforms, series like Avatar: The Last Airbender would underperform on PSP and Xbox 360, leading to many one-and-done releases, many internal admissions that maybe there wasn't a market for this particular kid-focused property on this or that system. Cheap hiccups when isolated, but they add up when THQ has to pay for licensing and royalties on each and every game that the company can't always recoup due to poor sales, or when game deadlines are strict to tie into the newest movie or season of a show, leading to crunch and poorer game quality, in turn leading to that cheap bargain bin perception that leads to lower sales and faster, deeper discounts. It's a feedback loop, and a dangerous one when a company builds its entire empire off of it without a backup plan. THQ signed lengthy contracts with the Nickelodeons and Disneys that often required a minimum number of games per year, games that THQ often knew would flop, but that it was required to sink money into anyway. During an interview with Polygon, a former manager at THQ recalled, quote, "Near the end, we were still getting screwed for Nickelodeon games, which we hadn't worked on in years. We still owed a ton of money," end quote. In the same year that THQ posted its record profits, the iPhone first released, with the App Store launching the following year, both occurring right as the Great Recession began. For more reasons than one, it suddenly became a lot more appetizing for parents to spend $1 or $2 on games that could entertain their kids, rather than $40 or more. Remember Halfbrick, that independent Australian developer that mostly worked on handheld ports of licensed THQ games? I named them earlier because they would become a shining example of this market shift. They developed the wildly successful Fruit Ninja and Jetpack Joyride, and never looked back. Children's media licenses began jumping to the cheaper smartphone platforms as well, leaving countless studios and thousands of employees across the industry with nothing to work on. THQ wasn't the only one hit with this devastating 1-2 punch. EA laid off hundreds in 2008 and 2009. Activision, despite its soaring success thanks to your Guitar Heroes and Call of Duties, it laid off around 500 employees between 2008 and 2010, some of those taking place as part of the merger with Blizzard, a company that itself was also weathering these new, stormy waters. The already struggling Midway lost another 100+ employees, and THQ cut its mobile game staff by 100 to focus on smartphone titles, before later closing a third of its studios and laying off another 600 console developers. Video games were, and still often are, called a recession-proof industry. Tell that to the unemployment line, both then and now. THQ's options were to embrace the uncertain smartphone game market and lay off another 1,000+ employees to pivot into that market, or read the room and shift away from licensed titles into original IP and games for the core gaming market. Also a risk given that it was unfamiliar territory for a company that had mostly been playing the hits for the last decade. But it was the path that much of the company, from the bottom all the way to the top, agreed was the only way forward. And that's why they didn't do that. Well, sorta, and this is where we start getting into the U-Draw. Mere weeks before that massive round of layoffs in 2008, THQ had hired writer, TV and film director, and lifelong gamer Danny Bilson to help head this new core gaming division direction. THQ had already started building up a core games division separate from the licensed side of the company, with games like a Warhammer MMO, Darksiders, a new Red Faction game, and Saints Row 2 all in production well before Bilson joined, a promising slate of original IP that had enticed him to sign on in the first place, only for THQ to cut its budgets by up to 50% within weeks of his hire date. Bilson had held a similar role at EA in prior years as a creative lead, with credits on the original Sims game as well as many of EA's James Bond and Harry Potter titles, and THQ rewarded Danny here for joining by cutting his options and budget in half immediately. Now, bringing a core gamer into an executive role at a company that had mostly been working on children's games for years and years led to a culture shock on both sides, further adding to the fun. The core games team apparently latched on to Bilson quickly, seeing that he cared about genuine game quality in a way that executives usually didn't. The licensed developers, however, didn't care for somebody coming in and making so many suggestions to their projects since they were on such tight deadlines as it was due to licensing agreements. Apparently, Bilson was also pretty straightforward with his ideas, which was a bit crass to the folks who had been living and breathing Jimmy Neutron, Britney Spears, Pixar, and Scooby-Doo for the better part of their careers. Keep the deadline issue in mind for later. Bilson wasn't just some up till 4 AM dude bro gamer, however. I mean, he did stay up till 4 AM sometimes playing the newest AAA titles according to other employees, but that was so that he could try and chat about the latest and greatest the competition was putting out. Despite maybe coming off as a super core gamer, he's actually the one who greenlit the UDraw game tablet during the brief time that he actually had a say outside of THQ's new core games division. The concept for a drawing tablet peripheral had come to two of THQ Australia's marketing team, not designers, as a way to complement a Wii sequel to the successful DS game Drawn to Life. At the time that it was greenlit, we weren't quite yet fully inundated with 100 million plastic guitars and Wii remote attachments all sitting in our garages. Peripherals were all the rage, even more so than the phrase all the rage, and with the Wii itself still impossible to find in 2008 due to incredible demand even in the face of the recession, it was a no-brainer to get in on that action. Or at least it was a no-brainer for a company that wasn't publicly committing to a core gaming focus. Again, say one thing, do another. This is what killed THQ, the company's reluctance to fully commit, its half measures. Just a moment ago, I snuck in a reference to a Warhammer MMO that was in development, a bold move for a company even at the peak of its influence considering how many new staff would need to be hired to deal with community management, online support and customer service, all the server costs, and this is after they had just laid people off. Monthly recurring subscription income from players is nice, and that was the idea in mind, but providing a product that can earn those subs is a whole different story. I mean, look at us losers here on YouTube, we can barely convince 20% of viewers to subscribe, and this shit is free. THQ with this Warhammer MMO was staring down a completely different world than the Nickelodeon and Disney games it had built its empire on, and yet this company that was barely even engaging with local co-op threw millions of dollars at the most complex of online experiences before realizing too little too late how much of a money pit this was going to be. All the while, even after the recession layoffs began, even after THQ cut all of its production budgets by 1/3 to 1/2, even after saying in public financial disclosures that it was going to shift focus to 1 or 2 AAA core titles per year, the company was still penning new licensing agreements for kids and family games, spending most of its money on that side, and giving that family division unsupervised free rein to do whatever it wished with that budget. It wasn't like that family game side of the company didn't have an exceptional grasp on the market at times, though, and UDraw's instant success was a testament to knowing what younger kids would want, and what they could get those kids' parents to purchase. Now, in a strange twist of fate, despite inspiring the UDraw game tablet's creation, no Drawn to Life game ever was made compatible with it, as the main developer also created the far more successful Scribblenauts series around the same time, and moved in that direction with WB instead.
How would you defeat a dangerous shadow creature?
I draw fish.
Now there is another peripheral that I want to talk about really quick, and it's not a gimmicky one, it's the sponsor of today's video, Mantis Sleep. If you're like me, you sleep. That's the sentence. And even though we all put it off to stay up late or whatever it might be, everybody knows just how important sleep hygiene truly is. And Manta's array of sleep masks is here to help anybody and everybody get the most comfortable rest possible, whether it's overnight or just for a quick nap. I've actually used sleep masks for a couple of years now because I'm a menace who sometimes gets too cozy to get up and go turn the lights off. And genuine testimonial here, Manta's got the most comfortable ones I've ever tried. Even as a side sleeper, the masks black out genuinely every bit of light, and I have gotten more restful sleep testing out the Manta Pro and their silk masks that they sent to me than I've had in a long, long time. Whether it's their regular sleep mask or the upgraded Pro model, their weighted masks, their super comfy silk mask, no matter what, these babies are built to be tweaked to your specific sleep needs. You want a slightly tighter fit or you're worried it might fall off during the night? Well, their straps are infinitely adjustable and you don't have to worry about putting too much pressure on your eyes, even if you're a side sleeper thanks to the Pro's C-cups. The eye cup shape. I should have said that better. Best of all, they don't even break the bank. If you're looking to get a bit more rest out of your nights, or even just upgrade your naps, check out Manta Sleep at my link below and enter the code GOLDENBOLT at checkout to get 10% off your order. Thanks again to Manta for sponsoring this segment, and now, let's get back to it. So instead, when the UDraw released in November 2010, it launched with 3 games. There was the Pack-In UDraw Studio, your simple drawing tablet app, there was Pictionary, and there was a really cute side-scroller named Dude's Big Adventure, which let you customize the designs of the hero, enemies, and many background elements using the drawing and painting features that were essentially ripped right out of UDraw Studio. Almost all of these games share that free draw as one of their optional game modes. Dude's Big Adventure is easily the best or maybe second best use of the tablet as far as creativity goes, with 60 platforming levels to play across 4 different gameplay styles. Now, moving by writing with the stylus when swiping is also used for drawing and attacking isn't the most wieldy option, but the levels are decently replayable thanks to a fun time and collection-based scoring system. Swapping from sort of light puzzle platforming to a 2D monkey ball kind of game to using your stylus as a fan to push your hero around in a balloon, it feels like the kind of game you would see Nintendo itself making 2 years later with the Wii U's gamepad, just a less polished version of that. And being able to see your own creations make an impact in the background or on the enemies themselves, or any of the obstacles that might show up in the stages, it's really, really neat. The game tablet itself works surprisingly well for what you might expect from a gimmicky early 2010s peripheral. The Wii remote slots into one side so that you have access to motion controls and some buttons for things like erasing, swapping drawing tools, or zooming in and out, as well as powering the tablet with the Wiimote batteries. The stylus has 2 connected buttons around where your thumb would go, and the tip of the pen is also a pressure-sensitive button of its own of sorts. The tracking is mostly solid, even doing a good job of following the stylus when it's not making contact with the drawing surface. It's light, it's balanced, and it feels pretty comfortable to hold, and the motion controls feel centered despite the Wiimote being on the left side of the tablet. Putting it all together, it's not hard at all to see why this device succeeded on the Wii. Just as a drawing tablet alone, ignoring any actual video games released for it, younger kids could find endless entertainment playing with the different drawing tools, using colors and canvases that they probably didn't have with colored pencils and paper alone, with a genuinely fun little game in Dude's Adventure, and even a solid tie-in with Pictionary, which features some fun challenge modifiers like limited ink, or only using the straight line tool, or a rotating canvas. It honestly might be one of the more unique ways to play Pictionary. With all of these games rounding out the early lineup, it showed a variety that you rarely saw from a third-party device, especially this early in the system's lifespan. Even prior to its release, industry analysts were predicting this tablet could be a sleeper hit. Arguably, they were just assuming it would succeed because the Wii was printing money at the time and the iPad had launched just prior to the UDraw's announcement, but whatever the reason was, they were right. Once this thing did land, it couldn't stay on shelves for long. Every other UDraw game after these first 3 launch titles, all 5 of them, they were licensed games, a few of them absolutely forcing the tablet integration just to pad the game tablet's lineup. In April 2011, shortly after THQ had built up enough backstock to release the tablet in Europe and Australia, came WayForward's SpongeBob's Squigglepants, probably the best UDraw game overall, since drawing apps aren't the most thrilling video games. This one's a WarioWare-styled microgame collection, really creative too, with each collection of games using its own art style to match the endless creativity the tablet was marketed as allowing. A month later, a Kung Fu Panda 2 tie-in game released on every platform under the sun, except the Wii version specifically, instead of being a usual Wii woggle game, it forced UDraw integration. A beat-em-up where the stylus both moves you and requires swiping for attacks? No bueno. It also crashed on the opening level for me, so I can't really say much more about it. In September, another DreamWorks tie-in dropped, this time a Penguins of Madagascar game, which does use the stylus controls a little bit better for the Wii version, but the Wii version's UDraw requirement was so clearly tacked on since almost every action has a regular button press alternative to drawing circles with the stylus while holding one of the thumb buttons to do a simple action. It's also one of Neil Patrick Harris's only video game credits. Surprisingly, he reprised his role from the cartoon in this game. He was only in like 3 episodes of the show, but he's in the game. A couple months later, at the start of November 2011, THQ released a Disney Princess paint-by-numbers storybook game. Paint-by-numbers is not a turn of phrase here, that's what this game's main gimmick is. Then on November 15th, launching alongside the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions of the game tablet, came Marvel Superhero Squad Comic Combat. This one's another beat-em-up game kinda like the Kung Fu Panda one, although this one at least has you tap to send your characters to a specific spot instead of constantly dragging the stylus to move, so it's a lot better. Comic combat is honestly pretty cute overall, with each of the 6 levels split into multiple comic panel chapters, pulling the camera back to show you in the pages of a physical comic book issue. Nothing special really, but it's got enough character variety to keep a kid entertained for at least a little while. Now, there was at least one more U-Draw title planned that we know of, called Disney Animator. However, there's very little info on this game, but this was apparently intended to be the true killer app of the tablet, the quote-unquote most unique drawing tool in games, according to the company's CEO. Presumably, this would have let you draw and animate different scenes featuring an array of Disney characters. During this game's behind-closed-doors announcement at E3 2012, the CEO also indicated that there were at least 6 more U-Draw games in development, which, depending on your interpretation, may mean that there were 2 further unknown U-Draw titles. Now, something interesting is that Disney Animator is one of the only games from THQ's Kids, Family, and Casual division that got delayed pretty much ever, getting pushed back to March 2012 and then a further half year back so that it could launch on U-Draw for Wii, PS3, and Xbox 360, as well as be a regular Wii U launch title. Remember when I said to keep THQ's issues with deadlines in mind? Well, here's where another of the company's many double standards caused some issues. Pretty much from the jump, the newer core games division seemed to get constant flack from the kids and family side because, well, where are the games? The more tenured developers on the kids teams were used to cranking out multiple projects a year on tight deadlines with no room to adjust budgets, so for THQ's publicly announced priority to be these big budget titles that wouldn't come out for 2 or 3 years or even longer, why were unknown studios like Vigil working on expensive MMOs or $20 million budget games like Darksiders for years at a time? What were they doing that was so special, huh? And the core games team was pressured on the other side by THQ's upper brass, who took years to accept that these original IPs didn't necessarily have to operate on the same rigid release structure as all of the licensed games, because quality mattered more here than the timeline pitched 2 years prior at the start of pre-production. It wasn't tied to a movie's release date, so the release date could be a little fluid. Earlier in 2011, the FPS Homefront wasn't allowed the few months of polish that it may have needed to go from a middling game into a game that had a chance at succeeding in such a saturated FPS market. Instead, the company stuck to its original deadline, review scores be damned. As a result, THQ's stock tanked 26% after Homefront released to those damned mediocre reviews, and the company shut down Homefront's developer 3 months after release, even though the game had sold fairly well. THQ's CEO before and after this point had publicly pandered that core gaming was their direction in order to appease shareholders, but his licensed game mentality, it never left. The inertia was too strong, and the ones who had the say and had the ability to make the changes were too afraid to commit. Where the core division's creative lead Danny Bilson apparently had to fight to allocate budgets for projects like Darksiders 2 or Metro 2033 or Evolve, or even money just to publish South Park: The Stick of Truth, a game whose production had already mostly been funded. While these constant battles went on, the family game side allegedly still operated with the majority of the company's development budget without any oversight. The family division had the autonomy to greenlight a PS3 and Xbox 360 version of U-Draw and pour millions of dollars into it, all without having any games in mind for these versions of the device. It didn't matter that seemingly nobody at the company thought that an HD version of U-Draw was a good idea, because that's how THQ was set up by this point. Left arm had its way, right arm had its way, and the head just let the two slap each other silly.
I call it the stranger.
So although pouring millions into an ill-advised MMO wasn't the best use of money, while continuing to blow money and resources on licensed games that actively cost more money than they could ever return was maybe a bad idea, and while it took going from a $6 stock price to $4.75 to learn what the upper brass had already been told by folks like Bilson, that delaying a game is sometimes okay, these were all symptoms of a very poorly run company, but not individually devastating. The U-Draw's HD console release? That was crippling, and it was the final straw for first the kids game division, as well as THQ as a company afterwards. Only 3 games were ever released for this version of U-Draw, all at launch in November 2011. There's an updated U-Draw Studio, an updated Pictionary, and that Marvel Comic Combat game. If those 2 updated games were being counted as part of those 6 games in the pipeline that the CEO had mentioned, then his math would have checked out, even if that is disgustingly misleading. But even if there were 2 other cancelled U-Draw games that we've just never heard about, former THQ employees all seem to agree that nowhere along the line was any game envisioned for this version of the tablet that would remotely appeal to the PS3 or Xbox's main audiences, which were of course different from the Wii's demographics. Remember, this company was really good most of the time at knowing exactly what demos that it could hit on which consoles. It meticulously cut out unnecessary platforms during the transition to the HD era when it found that certain properties underperformed on, say, Xbox 360, and yet this thing made it all the way through production without any of the upper management on the kids side of THQ questioning that fact. And somehow, since Bilson's core games team could only suggest or argue, not actually force a change, nobody thought to limit the U-Draw's production order on these HD systems. I really try to avoid the "what were they thinking" sort of phrasing when revisiting past failures or questionable decisions, but the company's own staff was screaming that sentiment, and with good reason. At launch, THQ had produced 2.5 million PS3 and Xbox 360 U-Draw tablets. That's 40% more than had been made and sold for the Wii across its entire first year on the market. The most generous defense possible, that this means they only made 1.2 million tablets for each system, still means they spent tens of millions of dollars on R&D and production for 2 new versions of the tablet that would work on 2 different systems, and that whoever had the checkbook thought it would be smart to have an entire year's worth of stock ready to go by launch day, all just assuming that they would fly off the shelves thanks to high demand for Pictionary and Marvel Comic Combat and nothing else for at least the first 6 to 12 months on the market. Outside of the early Xbox 360 with the Red Ring of Death issues, there has not been a physical production fiasco in the games industry on the level of this HD U-Draw disaster. It halved THQ's revenues for the quarter, it doubled its losses, and it directly led to the company defaulting on loans that could have been and would have been manageable if anybody in the chain of command had thought, wait, maybe we should cut this order down to maybe 1 million units total just to be safe. Not even cutting the doomed to fail HD versions entirely, just cutting the order size down. There's no excuse for this amount of malpractice. There was no possible breakout hit for THQ that could cover and make up that cost. Saints Row 3 overperformed expectations that very same quarter, which THQ lauded in its financial disclosures as evidence that its AAA strategy was working. WWE 12 was outperforming the prior year's game. Even Homefront had turned a profit that year despite the reviews and instantly having its staff killed off. But U-Draw on PS3 and Xbox, despite THQ hyping it up as part of what would drive a huge holiday season for the company, it dropped their outlook by $100 million due to the 1.4 million tablets sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and due to the million further units that were sitting on store shelves sold to retailers at a steep discount just to recoup anything at all. The company's stock price, which had dropped from $6 to $4.75 after Homefront's reviews had come in, had already been down to less than $1.50 by this point in December 2011, and it fell below $1 once THQ announced that because of the U-Draw, it had to lower its annual revenue projections significantly. THQ's stock only ever rose back above $1 6 months later after they consolidated stock just to avoid being removed from the New York Stock Exchange. U-Draw was one of the company's biggest successes in recent years, and yet it also ended up becoming the weight around its ankles, the one debt it couldn't overcome. Because of U-Draw's complete and total failure on the PS3 and Xbox, THQ killed off its kids and family division shortly thereafter, laying off hundreds of employees in order to focus solely on its last few chances at survival with the core games team. 5 years after the company's peak of over 2,500 employees, it had fallen to only a few hundred. In May 2012, Danny Bilson was laid off as well, seemingly taking the fall despite his core games division performing at or above expectations up to this point, with former Naughty Dog co-founder Jason Rubin joining the company in order to prepare it for sale to a private company named Clear Lake Capital Group. Much of the remaining money the company had was already going into ads for that summer's Darksiders 2, a game that also didn't meet sales expectations thanks to a knee-jerk marketing push that may have cost up to $25 million, doubling the game's budget. This was in a desperate attempt to sell it as this true AAA experience and juice THQ's fiscal reports, since the company had to delay all of its other 2012 titles into 2013 for polish and to avoid another homefront catastrophe. The feeling within the company, both before another set of layoffs and even in the waning hours of its existence, was that if they could make it to the release of Metro Last Light or South Park or any of its new IP in development for the PS4 and Xbox One, if they could make it another year or so with an investment or a private sale, THQ could survive. And those games did end up overperforming expectations when they released, under different publishers. THQ filed for bankruptcy in December 2012 as part of its attempt to get bought out and go private. However, it hadn't properly notified the public that it was actually trying to sell until after it had signed NDAs and other binding agreements with Clear Lake in secret, according to the judge who then denied that sale. Instead, THQ was broken up, its different remaining studios and IP being sold to the highest bidders for mostly pennies on the dollar. Koch Media acquired the rights to Saints Row and Metro, releasing Metro Last Light mere months after THQ had to delay it. In Last Light's first week in the US, it beat the first game's lifetime sales. Crytek bought the rights to Homefront since it was the studio currently working on a Homefront sequel. Take-Two took over the WWE license as well as the rights to publish Evolve, and just about everything else was acquired by an upstart publisher named Nordic, eventually even the THQ name. It's hard not to wonder what the company's outlook may have been had the U-Draw simply never been greenlit in the first place. Sure, if the Wii version never gets started, that's a strong success that never hits THQ's bank account, but that also means that all of that money and far more isn't lost due to the baffling HD versions. But then, even without that failure, does THQ's CEO ever pull the trigger on killing off the family game division that was by and large hemorrhaging money, or do the two sides of this company continue to pull apart at the seams anyway, even as the core game side shows steady growth? I believe that if not for the U-Draw, the company does at least have the funds to hang on through the PS4 and Xbox One's launches at the end of 2013, that they make it to the launches of Metro and South Park. Whether it could have dug out of the hole from there, we'll never know, but it clearly needed to take a life-or-death disaster for the company to finally commit to the plan that it had been selling investors on for half a decade by that point, so I'll say that I doubt they would have made it through in the end. You could say, and you'd be correct, that U-Draw was more a symptom of a far, far larger issue within THQ, but when you lose more money with one mistake than you were in the hole for to begin with, that mistake is ultimately what killed you, even if you were on a fast track to stepping into 1,000 other holes that would have taken you out anyway. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to run to Costco to grab a 2.4 million pack of paper towels. What? It's cheaper to buy in bulk. If you'd like to watch videos just like this early or even ad-free, you can do so for as little as $1 a month over at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. You'll also get into the exclusive Golden Cult Discord server and get your name in these credits with fine folks like Rodney220, The Critic of Innocence, Thomas Kuzma, Jump Rock, and so many more. Thank you.